Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Apocryphal Gospels in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. We've already talked about the Gospel of Thomas. If you don't recall that, go back and look at the video on the pseudonymous writings, the pseudonymous writings of, they weren't New Testament writings, but of early Christianity. These were writings that whose author was pretending to be one person, or he was really another. Thomas was one of those. It's not written by Thomas. This is part of the Nag Hammadi collection found in 1945, written in Coptic, that is in Egyptian, reflects Gnostic themes. And all of these that we're talking about in this session are going to talk, they're going to give Gnostic themes. It's a collection of supposed sayings of Jesus. No historical narrative is included. It's just a list of about 120 different statements that supposedly Jesus made. At certain points, it's just borrowing right from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but then it also branches out. We looked at some of those already. I'm going to look at a few other quotes from the gospel, the so-called Gospel of Thomas. It begins, these are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. And he said, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. A bit later, he says, Jesus said, blessed is the lion which becomes man when consumed by man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the lion becomes man. You say, what on earth is that describing? And I'm not going to really comment on its theology. Sometimes it's trying to sound witty and just, in my opinion, sounds a little foolish. Jesus says to his disciples, compare me to someone and tell me who I am like. Simon Peter said to him, you are like a righteous angel. Matthew said to him, you are like a wise philosopher. Thomas, of course, this is the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas said to him, Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like. Jesus said, I am not your master. You say, wait a minute. I don't recall Jesus ever saying anything like that. Indeed, his disciples would sometimes call him master, and he didn't tell them not to do that. Jesus said, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." It's sort of a spiritual intoxication. I think somebody might have been intoxicated here. And he took him and withdrew and told him three things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, what did Jesus say to you? Thomas said to them, if I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up. In other words, this secret knowledge that supposedly Jesus told Thomas, but he can't repeat it because it's blasphemous. It probably is blasphemous. I think the writer is correct in that regard. And then we already noted this one. Simon Peter said to them, make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life. Jesus said, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. And I will leave the Gospel of Thomas on that note. Next, we come to the Gospel of Philip. This is also part of the Nag Hammadi collection, also found in southern Egypt. Similar to the Gospel of Thomas, it's Coptic, it has the same Gnostic themes. Again, it's a collection of sayings of Jesus. And again, there's no historical narrative to it. Here's a segment from that. A Hebrew man makes a Hebrew, and they call him a proselyte. But a proselyte does not make a proselyte. And you think, well, why not? What's the point? And again, I'm not really going to try to comment on the thinking of whoever it is. This was not written by Philip. This is written at the very earliest, sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century. It goes on a bit later. Those who inherit dead things are themselves dead, and they inherit dead things. Those who inherit what is living are alive and inherit both what is living and the dead. The dead do not inherit anything. And I would say, well, depends if you're talking about spiritual death or physical death. Um, I have an old friend who used to like to say, born once, die twice, born twice, die once. It was a little bit riddle, I think a much better one than the one that the Gospel of Philip is trying to present to us. Some said Mary conceived by the Holy Spirit. They are in error. They do not know what they are saying. When did a woman ever conceive by a woman? Mary is the virgin whom no power defiled. Notice what it is saying. It's denying the deity of Christ. It's denying the conception of Jesus at the hands of the Holy Spirit, where the baby within Mary was conceived by the Holy Spirit. It's denying Scripture a bit more. And this segment, notice where I've got dot dot dot. That's because the just like you can see in the picture, there are places in the Gospel of Philip where we're missing sections, and we're not sure exactly how much we're missing. So it seems to be speaking of Mary Magdalene and uses her name, and then a bit later it says loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. The rest of the disciples, and then there's a gap, they said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" And I'm not sure what it is they're trying to say about Jesus. Are they trying to presuppose? And some have tried to say, "Well, see, Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene." First of all, you would have to assume that the Gospel of Philip is in some way authentic, and it's not. It's a collection of silly sayings that somebody dreamed up, someone who had an intent to try to put their own teachings into the mouth of Jesus. A bit later, the forms of evil spirit include male ones and female ones. The males are they which unite with the souls which inhabit a female form, but the females are they which are mingled with those of a male form, though one who was disobedient. And so notice you're supposed to have is the idea of male demons and female demons, and they're each sort of cross-pollinating with men and women. And it's just if it strikes you as weird, that's because it is. He goes on and notice this is entitled the Gospel of Philip. So Philip the apostle said Joseph the carpenter planted a garden because he needed the wood for his trade. It was he, I'm assuming it's still referring to Joseph the carpenter, who made the cross from the trees which he planted. Um, that's an interesting theory, but no basis in reality. But notice it's trying to say Joseph made the cross on which Jesus died. He goes on, the world came about through a mistake. Now, here you're certainly seeing the Gnostic teachings come out from hiding. The world came about through a mistake, for he who created it wanted to create it imperishable and immortal. He fell short of attaining his desire, for the world never was imperishable, nor for that matter was he who made the world. For things are not imperishable, but sons are. So notice it's denying that the creator, that God is imperishable, because the Gnostics taught that the God who created the universe is not the God. He's sort of a lesser God who's bumbling around and making mistakes, and he's sort of overworked and underpaid, and just isn't up to the task of really filling the shoes of the bigger God who's over him. If that sounds a little bit like Mormonism, I think it does, and that's not where Mormonism comes from. But I think perhaps they both have an element of the same spirit within them. He goes on, when Abraham, and then there's a space here, so we're not sure what it is the intervening part, but it still seems to be speaking of Abraham when it says that he was to see what he was to see. He circumcised the flesh of the foreskin, teaching us that it is proper to destroy the flesh. And remember, Gnosticism taught that flesh is bad, spirit is good. That's why it taught that God didn't create the universe. It was just some sort of lesser God, because anything physical is necessarily bad, according to Gnosticism. Now, the Bible takes a very different view. The Bible has God creating in 6 days, and he looks over it and he says, it is good. That's quite a difference from Gnostic teachings. Next, I'd like to speak of the Gospel of Peter. You see Nag Hammadi there in the south. This was found instead at Akhmim, also in southern Egypt. It was found in 1886. Um, a 5th or 6th century manuscript is what was discovered, but if they're discovering a manuscript, then presumably it was written at an earlier era. Earlier copies have been found dating to the late 2nd century. So very, very early. Again, for them to find copies, that means that it was written even prior to that. Um, Serapion, who was the bishop of Antioch, this is after Ignatius, um, and he heard that they had found that somebody had brought a copy of the Gospel of Peter. Now, this was in the early days of the church. They didn't have not everyone had a copy of the completed canon, so the list was still getting out. And Serapion said, "Oh, good, we have another gospel. I hadn't heard of the Gospel of Peter, but that's good. Let's read it in the church." And then somebody came and corrected him and said, "Wait a minute, have you actually read what's in it?" And he took another look and he said, "Oh my goodness, I had no idea." And so he came back and reversed himself and said, "No, we cannot be reading that in the church. It's not one of the accepted gospel accounts." But you could see how easily somebody unknowing could be persuaded just by the title. So the Gospel of Peter, now the opening pages are lost. It does contain a story. In fact, the first 6 chapters are the Passion story. It doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus or with his miracles or teaching. It jumps right to, when I say the Passion, I'm speaking of his sufferings, his death, burial, and resurrection. Pilate is seen as good because he washed his hands of the whole matter, unlike Herod Antipas. So it's presenting Pilate as not all that bad, but Herod Antipas, he's really the villain of this story. Uh, it mentions how Jesus felt no pain on the cross. Now this smacks of what's called doceticism. Dokeo is to seem like, and what it's presenting as the idea is that Jesus really wasn't flesh. He only seemed to take on flesh. This is another Gnostic teaching. At one point, Jesus says in the Gospel of Peter, my power, why have you forsaken me?" And then, notice, it doesn't say then he died, then he is taken up, perhaps hinting at the idea that he didn't die. You see, the Gnostics teach that Jesus didn't die, he only seemed to die. So it's denying the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus. It's denying what Jesus accomplished on the cross. It's denying the gospel. In chapter 7, the Jews and the elders and the priests repent of what they had done. I don't see that in the Gospels. In fact, in the book of Acts, we see the elders and the priests, especially the leaders of the nation, take an even harsher stance against the apostles. They say, "Stop preaching in that name." Then the rest of chapter 7, all the way to the end of chapter 15, are the resurrection story. So let's read from that. In the night in which the Lord's day was drawing on, as the soldiers kept guard 2 by 2 in a watch, there was a great voice in the heaven, and they saw the heavens open, and 2 men descend with a great light, and approached the tomb, and the stone that was put at the door rolled of itself, and made way in part, and the tomb was opened, and both the young men entered in. When therefore those soldiers saw it, they awakened the centurion and the elders, for they too were close by and keeping guard. Notice it has everybody sort of gathered there. And as they declared what things they had seen, again they saw 3 men come forth from the tomb, and 2 of them supporting one, and a cross following. Now wait a second. They're not. Notice the way it's described. You don't have Jesus rising victoriously. You have some these men, perhaps angelic figures, who are carrying out what looks like almost a corpse. He's half dead. I don't see that in the Gospels. And then notice the cross comes out as well. You have a walking. In a minute, you're going to see a walking, talking cross. And the heads of the 2 reached to heaven. So these are very, very tall angels. But the head of him who was led by them overpassed the heavens. And so he gets even bigger. And they heard a voice from the heavens saying, "You have preached to them that sleep." And a response was heard from the cross. Here's the talking cross. And the cross says, "Yes." This is not true. You can see why the church looked at this and said, "This isn't what happened," and rejected the gospel of Peter. Finally, I want to talk about what's called the Gospel of Judas. Now, it's found near Beni Massar, Egypt, more recently in the 1970s. Notice how all of these were found in different places along the Nile River in Egypt. It wasn't translated until the early 2000s, so very relatively recently. Originally, there were 31 leaves, but most have been lost or fallen apart. So, not quite sure how many pages we have, but a lot of it is in just small pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle that you're trying to put together when you don't have all of the pieces. National Geographic, the magazine, purchased the Gospel of Judas because they wanted to hold on to it, and they purchased it, excuse me, in 2004. A couple of years later, they had, I think, perhaps a slow news day, and so they published this. Notice how the title page, "Decoding the Secrets of a 1700-year-old text." Notice 1700, that's in the 300s, where they're dating it to. Like the others, this is in Coptic. Like the others, this is a Gnostic writing, and it presents Judas as the Gnostic hero of the story. I think I've seen something similar to this in Thomas and Peter, but now in Judas. It begins the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during a week, 3 days before he celebrated the Passover. So, it's going to try to sell us is this idea that Judas is really the hero of the story. He's the only one who really knew what was going on, and he and Jesus concocted this plot. He began to speak with them about the mysteries beyond the world and what would take place at the end. Often he did not appear to his disciples as speaking of Jesus, not Judas. Often he did not appear to his disciples as himself, but he was found among them as a child. Notice what it's denying. It's denying the incarnation that Jesus actually became flesh. He only appeared to be certain things. When Jesus observed their lack of understanding, he said to them, "Why has this agitation led you to anger? Your God, who is," notice it's not my God or my Father, "your God who is within you," and then there's a piece that's missing because we only have this in part. It picks up a little bit later. Provoked you to answer within your souls. Let any one of you who is strong enough among human beings bring out the perfect human and stand before my face. I think Jesus was the perfect human, but this is denying that. But their spirits did not dare to stand before him, except, here's the hero, except for Judas Iscariot. He was able to stand before him, but he could not look him in the eyes and turned his face away. Judas said to him, "I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbelo." Now you say, Barbelo, what on earth is that? Um, Arbella is the Greek word for, and then ba is in, and so literally in for. And notice he continues, "And I'm not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you." Um, not that I'm not that you're anything special, Jesus, but somebody special sent you. And this is a term that was used among the Gnostics and other pagans to describe sort of a mother god, a mother goddess, sort of a female god. And so again, don't look now, but your paganism is showing. Knowing that Judas was reflecting upon something that was exalted, Jesus said to him, "Step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom." So, Gnosticism, remember, it's all about having hidden knowledge, hidden wisdom, and Judas is supposedly in the know on this. It is possible for you to reach it, but you will grieve a great deal, for someone else will replace you in order that the 12 may again come to completion with their God, not the God, just their God. Judas said to him, "When will you tell me these things? And when will the great day of light dawn for the generation?" But when he said this, Jesus left him. Now we have Jesus appearing in the next day. I'm just going to summarize some of these sections. They question where he has been, and they tell Jesus about a vision that they saw of the 12 men. This is the disciples. That they saw of 12 men at a temple, and he explains that they are the 12 men, and that they and the church will lead the people astray. After all, they're going to believe things that the Bible teaches about Jesus, not the things that the Gnostics teach. And so the Gnostic teaching is, oh, the church went astray. Here's the true things. Here's our hidden things. Judas then has a vision in which the other disciples are against him because, after all, we're going to try to make Judas the hero. We pick up, Jesus answered and said, "Judas, your star has led you astray." He continued, "No person of mortal birth is worthy to enter the house you have seen, for that place is reserved for the holy. Neither the sun nor the moon will rule there, nor the day, but the holy will abide there always in the eternal realm with the holy angels." By the way, one thing that you see here, sun and moon ruling, nor the day, sounds a little bit like something from the book of Revelation, which tells me they're borrowing from the book of Revelation, which was already out. So just a little side note as far as what they're where these sources are being derived from. We pick up where Judas asks about now his own fate, and Jesus tells him that he will be the 13th apostle and that he will rule over the others because he's going to have this special knowledge. He indoctrinates Judas into the Gnostic mysteries. And the fact that there are originally 72 aeons, and remember that's part of Gnosticism, and that a bad one appeared whose appearance was defiled with blood. That was the one who ended up creating heavens and earth, but he's the villain. Remember that's the lesser god, the God of the Old Testament. The bad one then makes his own aeons, and one of these is Saklas. This is already from Gnosticism. And Saklas creates human beings. Judas now looks up and sees the luminous cloud, and he enters it. And with this new insight, Judas now goes on to betray Jesus because he's doing the right thing. You see, it's trying to take Judas and make him the hero. Now, when we look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these were written very early. These are in the first century and were accepted by the church very early. You also have the book of Acts and then the other writings, the epistles. First of all, notice you've got the epistles of Paul from Romans all the way down to Philemon. And then by others, I just mean other authors, Hebrews. We're not sure who wrote it. I actually think Paul may have had his hand in it, although the language is a bit different from what you're used to in Paul's writings. Although remember, when Paul wrote, Paul regularly gave credit, and I'm going to assume he told the truth. He didn't always say, "I, Paul, am writing." Sometimes he would say, "Paul and Silvanus and Timothy writing to this church or that church." And so, according to Paul, if we believe him, that he often is writing as part of a committee. Now, I think he was probably the leader of that. He's sort of, but at times it might be that either Silas or Timothy or others that are with him said, "Well, you ought to say it this way," and Paul said, "That's a good idea. Let's have it written that way," and it would be someone else who did the actual writing. We've already talked about that in our class on writing in the New Testament world. So Paul himself probably didn't do the actual writing. He dictated quite a bit of it, but there might have been others involved with him. So you have Hebrews and James and First and Second Peter, First, Second, and Third John, Jude, and finally the book of Revelation. Now, the four Gospels, Acts, the Epistles of Paul, First Peter, and First John were known to the early church, and this is the term they use. I'm not making it up. They refer to these books as the homologomena, the books that were accepted by all. Everybody agreed that these books were authoritative in the church. But there were a few books, like Hebrews, like James, 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation, that some people actually had questioned and said, okay, most people are saying, Hebrews, but who wrote it? And because we don't know for sure who wrote it, we may have theories and opinions. Whoever received the book knew who wrote it because the writer actually gave us some personal information. He said, Timothy's about to be released, and he and I are going to come see you all. You say, well, that doesn't help us with the author. It tells us that it's not Timothy because he's mentioned in the third person. James, likewise, who wrote that? You say, well, didn't James write it? But there were a number of people in the early church by the name of James, so we don't know which James wrote it. We might have our theories. I certainly do. Second Peter, I'm not sure why that was questioned, except that perhaps it was a little slower to make the rounds than First Peter. Second and Third John are very short; they're almost like postcards, and so I imagine for that reason there may have been some wondering, and also, well, First John, First, Second, Third John, John does not name himself. Jude, which person named Jude is that? And also, Jude sounds a lot like portions of Second Peter, and so they wondered, is that sort of an addendum? Did somebody just take out portions and rewrite it? Um, and then the book of Revelation, I understand that because that was just puzzling, and what it's so very different from the rest of the New Testament with its apocalyptic genre, and so they weren't sure what to make of it. The author is named John, but he does not identify himself as John the Apostle. So was it John the Apostle, or was it another person named John? My own opinion, I think it was John the Apostle, but again, we're not told. So that we have the Gospels, in fact, the entire New Testament is written by the end of the first century. And then we move into the second century, and notice we have people like Ignatius and Polycarp who had actually been born much earlier, but they're still alive at the end of the first century, and they're referring to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're referring to the apostles, and they're referring to the writings of Paul. And Ignatius is saying, look, I'm writing to you, but my writing is not on the same level of Peter and Paul. They were apostles, and I'm just a bishop. I'm an overseer in the church. I'm trying to be faithful to what they said, and so he's calling as authoritative the writings of the apostles. Now, it's not going to be until later that we have the Gnostic uh, um, uh, both Gospels and other writings come out. You have the New Testament, you have the Apostolic Fathers, and then it's after this that you begin to have the Gnostics like Marcion. Marcion does not. One of the heretics. He's a Gnostic. He does not go and pick up the Gospel of Peter or Thomas or Judas because they weren't around yet. Instead, he takes Luke and sort of rewrites Luke and takes out the part he doesn't like and sort of republishes the Gospel of Luke. You have the Muratorian canon. This is a list of books that were appropriate to read in the churches. And it lists most of the books that we have in our New Testament. It doesn't mention any of the apocryphal gospels. It does talk about some other writings, and it actually mentions some that says, oh, these are nice writings, but don't read them in the church because they don't have the same authority. They were written more recently. Irenaeus lists all but 4 of the New Testament books. And then you eventually get in the days of Constantine, where Athanasius lists all 27 books of our New Testament. Now, I've mentioned this in another video, how Dan Brown came out with a fictional book, the Da Vinci Code. And in this fictional story, he has one of his characters who's supposed to be sort of authoritative and says how Constantine chose the books of the Bible and ordered other non-canonical books to be burned. That's simply not true. First of all, we have other non-canonical books, and a lot of them, like the the letters of Ignatius and the letter of Polycarp and the letter of Clement, they were passed on. Nobody tried to burn those. So that part's not true. And Constantine didn't choose the books of the Bible. They were already there. They were already recognized, although there were a few that had been questioned. That the Gospels were edited after the Council of Nicaea. That's so flagrantly false because we found copies that predate that. And they're the same gospels. Sometimes there's a typo here or there. Try copying anything by hand, and you're going to make an occasional typo. But they are the same gospels. They teach the same thing. They teach about Jesus and his death and burial and resurrection. That the Gnostic Gospels are older than the four canonical Gospels. That is simply a lie. I remember when the book first came out, a professor of history got into a conversation with me. He says, "Aren't you worried about Dan Brown and the truths that he has uncovered?" And I said, "Not really. I mean, it might have been a fun book to read, sort of blasphemous, but certainly has no truth in it. And likewise, I wasn't worried about the movie National Treasure and about how there's this secret map on the back of the United States Declaration of Independence. It was fiction. It was fun fiction, but it was fiction. We do not base our faith upon works of fiction. And we don't base our faith on the works of fiction when we come to the Bible because the Bible has given us truth.